Part 1. The observers arrive, explained in 1100 words. In the vast and ancient galaxy, war was nothing new. Dozens of intelligent species had risen, expanded, and battled over territory, resources, and ideology for thousands of years. From the brutal trench warfare of the insectoid Gorl to the mind-based duels of the psionic Velthera. War was understood as a form of expressions, sometimes tragic, sometimes necessary, but always studied and categorized. No group took that categorization more seriously than the Xelari Consortium. The Xelari were a peaceful, scholarly species known for their immense data archives and deep obsession with recording historical and military events. They considered themselves the galaxy's neutral observers, always watching, always learning, never interfering. The Consortium had cataloged over 17,000 wars across 93 species and believed they had seen everything war had to offer. Victory and defeat, courage and cowardice. Tactics and technology, it was all data to them, patterns, probabilities. So when news reached the Consortium that a newly spacefaring species called humans were on the brink of their first interstellar war, the Xelari prepared their observational vessels without hesitation. This was a rare and valuable opportunity, the first war of a new species. They wanted to understand how humanity waged war when pushed beyond diplomacy. The humans had only recently joined the galactic stage. Earth had been relatively quiet, building colonies, trading, and forming alliances. But now, civil tensions had erupted between Earth's central government and a group of rebellious colonies demanding autonomy. The dispute was largely political, but it had escalated rapidly. A line had been crossed. War was inevitable. The Consortium dispatched research vessel Thatnine, captained by Overseer Tellin, to the orbital region around the human colony of New Sapporo, the conflict's predicted starting point. Talon was experienced, having observed conflicts on 7 different death worlds. He didn't expect anything remarkable. A few naval skirmishes, perhaps some localized ground fighting, typical behavior for a species trying to assert control. Over rebellious territory, the Xelari vessels settled into stealth orbit, activating high-range observation lenses and neural feedback receivers. These devices didn't just collect visuals or audio, they translated emotional energy, group cohesion signals, and even battlefield intent into data the Xelari could interpret. As the Terran fleet approached New Sapporo, Telen made a routine. Entry in the ship's log: engagement imminent, human strategic intent unclear, combat behavior pending analysis. What followed made that log entry the last ordinary thing recorded aboard the Theta-9. The opening salvo of the human warships didn't initiate contact with a warning broadcast or declaration of intent. There were no ceremonial shows of force. Without hesitation, the first Shippa, heavily armed destroyer, called the CNS Archangel, entered the colony's orbit and fired a precision kinetic rod into the rebel-controlled planetary shield generator. The attack was surgical. In seconds, the entire defense grid collapsed, exposing the colony. Before the rebels could react, a wave of human stealth drop pods broke through the atmosphere, each carrying a small squad of elite Terran Marines. It was a tactic the Xelari hadn't seen in centuries. Close quarters assault with maximum risk and overwhelming precision. The human soldiers hit the ground running. Their exoarmor shimmered with reactive nanofiber, and they moved with an intensity that the Consortium's neural scanners failed to categorize. Every combat motion carried weight. Every decision was rapid. Almost instinctive, the Xelari sensors, built to measure emotional intensity across battlefields, began to overload. What should have been a manageable skirmish quickly turned into a symphony of fire, motion, and death. A new kind of warfare to the Xelari. War was usually predictable. Species followed patterns: cautious advancement, resource conservation, or morale-based tactics. Even violent species typically paused too, regroup or retreat, but the humans didn't. The moment one of their squads encountered heavy resistance, they didn't fall back or call for extraction. Instead, they adapted on the fly, mid-combat, without centralized command. Squad leaders shifted roles fluidly. Medics became grenadiers. Engineers rigged mining equipment into battlefield tools within minutes. In one sector of the colony, a group of Terran infantry found themselves pinned down by enemy turrets. Rather than wait for artillery support, they used a damaged power conduit to fry the enemy's circuits, sacrificing their own safety in the process. 2 humans were critically injured, yet the others carried them into cover while continuing the assault without a moment's hesitation. The consortium's data translators began to struggle with classification. The humans displayed fear without paralysis, pain without hesitation, loss without retreat. There was something else. Something alien, even to the alien observers. The humans seemed to enjoy it, not in the sense of cruelty or bloodlust, but in their sheer resolve to overcome. Every obstacle wasn't a setback, it was a challenge. Every injury, a story they would carry as fuel, the neural recorders recorded. Emotional feedback so intense it physically affected the Zalari observers. One junior analyst suffered a neural cascade collapse essentially. His mind shut down from the intensity of human emotion flooding through the data stream. The shattering of expectations overseer Talen was shaken, not by the bloodshed. He had seen worse. But by the contrast between the humans' outward simplicity and their internal complexity. They were not genetically engineered super soldiers. They had no psionic enhancements or hive minds. They relied on primitive combustion-based firearms and kinetic bombardment tactics. Most species abandoned eons ago, and yet they were winning. Not because they had superior weapons, but because they had an unrelenting will, no matter the losses, no matter the pain. They adapted, they advanced, they endured. The Zalari had always considered endurance a passive trait, something species fell back on when they lacked strength. But the humans made it an offensive strategy. They didn't just survive. They overwhelmed through persistence alone. Talen recorded one final private note in his personal databank. We have not discovered a primitive war. We have discovered something else, something unmeasured. This is not about power. This is something deeper. We are not prepared. The silence after battle, when the initial fighting ended and the human fleet secured New Sapporo, the battlefield was silent. The Zalari expected fanfare, boasts, perhaps celebration. But there was none. The humans gathered their dead, treated their wounded, and began rebuilding, quietly, efficiently, as though this were simply a part of living. The Zalari observers couldn't speak, not out of fear, but because they didn't know what to say. Their centuries of analytical frameworks had failed them. This wasn't just a first war, it was a revelation. In war, they'd seen many things, but this was something new, something that made them question everything they thought they understood about violence, survival, and the will to fight. Part 2, No Mercy, No Pause, explained in 1100 words after the Battle of New Sapporo. The Zalari Consortium had hoped what they had seen was an anomaly, an unusually intense first strike from a desperate species. Surely, they reasoned, the rest of the war would settle into more predictable rhythms. Even the most volatile species cooled over time. But they were wrong. What happened next was not a strategic campaign. It was not a lesson in restraint. It was, in the Zalari's own words, an avalanche without pause. The human counterattack on the rebel colony of Novus Vega would etch itself permanently into the minds of everyone who witnessed it, especially the Zalari researchers watching silently from orbit. Background: the fall of Novus Vega had once been one of humanity's crown jewels, an outer rim colony rich in resources and innovation.
Wow.
But when the rebellion began, Vega's local leadership aligned with the separatists, citing unfair economic control from Earth. At first, their resistance was political and ideological. Then it turned violent. Worse still, the rebels on Novus Vega did something that marked them forever in Terran memory. They took hostages, not military prisoners, but civilians from Earth-based diplomatic envoy teams, researchers, and even children. From cultural exchange programs, the message was clear: back off, or we start executing. Too many species in the galaxy, such tactics were a grim but familiar tool of war coercion through terror. But humanity's response wasn't negotiation. It wasn't a slow, diplomatic maneuver. It was Operation Scorchfell. The operation begins from orbit. The Zalari observed as 6 Terran warships broke through Vega's defensive perimeter in tight formation. Rebel commanders on the surface expected a warning transmission. Instead, they got silence. Within minutes, atmospheric anomalies appeared, black specks that streaked through the sky. Avoiding detection by the colony's defense grid, the Terrans had deployed stealth orbital drop pods. A maneuver last used centuries ago by pre-space-faring militaries. The Zilari were stunned. These pods were manually guided, extremely dangerous, and had a low survival rate, yet every human unit volunteered without hesitation. The pods pierced the clouds and slammed into the colony's outskirts. What emerged? From them changed the entire war. The Terran Shock Regiments, the units dropped into Vega, were part of Terran Shock Regiment's elite infantry, bred for rapid deployment, urban warfare, and psychological suppression. They wore adaptive exo-armor that blurred visual profiles and absorbed incoming data from the battlefield in real time. But what horrified the Zalari wasn't just the gear, it was how these humans moved. Unlike most militaries that relied on squads and ranks, Terran units operated more like packs of predators. They moved low, fast, in silence, striking like ghosts, vanishing just as quickly. Their coordination was so tight that they often didn't need to speak during combat. They read each other's movements like a language. They didn't fire warning shots. They didn't call for surrender. Every rebel stronghold they encountered was neutralized, efficiently and permanently. Breaking the colony's back, the rebels had prepared for a siege. They had dug bunkers, fortified buildings, and shielded key infrastructure. But nothing prepared them for the way humans fought. The Zilari noted the tactical sequence as it unfolded. First, the humans cut power to the city's core grid. Then, they flooded communication networks with deep-faked surrender orders, causing rebel confusion. Simultaneously, they used civilian sewer and maintenance routes to infiltrate control points from below. In one sector, a human squad repurposed mining drones into explosive breachers, using local tools to push deeper into fortified zones. The level of adaptation and improvisation was terrifying, and they did it, without pausing, even when pinned down. Terran forces pushed forward. Even when outnumbered, they held their ground with a ferocity that confused enemy targeting systems, because their actions didn't align with any known military doctrine. To the Zilari, war was usually about momentum and supply chains. But the humans ignored those rules. They didn't wait for ideal conditions, they forced them into existence. The cost of compassion, but the most confusing element, to the Zilari, was the humans' treatment of their own. In one part of the city, surveillance captured a human soldier, taking a direct energy blast to the leg. He collapsed, unable to move. The enemy advanced. Instead of leaving him or calling for a medic drone, 2 of his comrades broke formation under heavy fire, carried him to cover, applied field surgery manually, and then used him as a spotter while they pushed forward. One of them was wounded in the process. This wasn't efficient, wasn't logical by most strategic standards. But to the humans, it was unquestionable. The Zalari struggled to process this. Their database labeled it illogical loyalty behavior, a trait considered detrimental in most military models. But here against all logic it worked. Human units operated with an unshakable bond, sacrificing themselves without hesitation to protect others. It wasn't duty, it was devotion. And that devotion made them fight harder, longer. With a fury that refused to break, the hostage facility, the operation's final phase, focused on the hostage containment facility in Sector Thetaphore. The rebels had fortified the structure with automated turrets, shield walls, and kill switches wired to each cell. Any attempt to break in would likely result in the hostages' deaths. The humans didn't break in, they broke beneath, using seismic drills. From abandoned mining operations, they tunneled beneath the facility undetected. They bypassed every sensor, every alarm. At exactly 0400 local time, a hole opened beneath the primary power core. and the human units stormed up through the floor like wrath itself. The rebels tried to activate the kill switches. They didn't work. The Terrans had already disabled the power relays. In less than 7 minutes. Every rebel guard in the facility was neutralized. All 212 hostages were rescued without a single civilian casualty. The aftermath. Humans didn't pause for celebration. They didn't broadcast propaganda or raise flags. The moment the colony was secure, they began evacuation procedures, loaded the wounded, and prepared to redeploy. To the Zalari, it felt unreal. They had seen wars last decades over minor disputes. They had seen empires crumble trying to do what humans had done in 36 hours. Overseer Talon, watching from his command. Dek could barely speak. He turned to his analysts and asked, "What drives them to move like this?" None had an answer. But the neural recorders, the systems designed to interpret emotional data, captured one final burst of signals from the soldiers as they pulled out of Novus Vega. It wasn't rage. It wasn't vengeance. It was grief. Something deeper. Resolve, no mercy, no pause, operation. Korchville proved to the Zalari that humanity wasn't just another species learning war. They were redefining it, not through advanced weaponry or psychic tricks, not through overwhelming numbers, but through, the kind of relentless drive that didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, and didn't need rest to keep moving. To many species, mercy was a strength. To others, a weakness. The humans had their own version. They were merciless to their enemies because they were so merciful to their own. Every soldier lost was not just a name. It was a reason to push harder. The Zalari had never seen anything like it. And after Novus Vega, some of them stopped watching. Because if this was only humanity's first war, what would they become in the wars to come? Part 3. The Death March of Ceres, explained in 1100 words after the terrifying precision of Operation Scorchfell. The Zalari observers believed they had seen the peak of human warfare. Surely, they reasoned, nothing could exceed the sheer intensity. Of Novus Vega, they were wrong. What came next wasn't just a military operation. It was a trial by hellfire, a showcase of raw endurance and suffering that defied logic and expectation. It happened on the fractured mining, Alania Suri Savannah, small but strategically vital rock in the asteroid belt that had declared allegiance to the Separatists. It was cold, dark, and brittle, but held enough rare isotopes to fund 100 wars. Earth couldn't afford to let it fall into rebel hands. So, they sent in the Terrans again. The nanoplague. A trap set by desperation, the rebels knew they couldn't win a direct confrontation. After the fall of Novus Vega, they had no illusions about human tactical superiority. So, they turned to something far more insidious. Nanoplague warfare. The weapon was illegal under every known galactic code. It consisted of molecular-scale machines, programmable nanites, that specifically targeted synthetic compounds like metals, polymers, and composites. Armor, energy weapons, vehicles, medical tech, communication links, all were rendered inert or consumed within minutes of exposure. When the human vanguard arrived on Ceres, the nanoplague was already seeded across the landing zones. The Terran landing force watched in horror as their ships' hulls corroded. Their weapons melted, and their communications blacked out. Their armor dissolved mid-mission, leaving elite soldiers exposed on a Class 4 death world, with only atmospheric suits and cold steel. To the Zalari observers, this should have been a death sentence. But a WASN, T-TAST, adaptation without hesitation. Instead of retreating, the Terran command structure activated Protocol Iron Bluta, little-known contingency that bypassed reliance on advanced tech and returned soldiers to their most primal, rugged combat mode, old-school warfare. Within an hour, Terran soldiers were rearmed with ballistic railguns, machetes, manually aimed explosives, and retrofitted industrial equipment salvaged from nearby mining outposts. The Zalari were stunned. These tools were obsolete by centuries, even millennia, by galactic standards. Yet the humans wielded them like extensions of their own will. They didn't pause. They didn't complain. They simply moved. The consortium recorded field commanders sketching out assault plans using sticks in the dirt, sending runners with physical paper maps through the cold wind. Every weakness, every fallback point, every position was calculated without digital assistance. Talon noted, "This is not a fallback strategy. This is resurrection from ashes." March into the frozen Kortha. Rebels had retreated into a fortified subterranean facility near the equatorial crevasse of Sirius 7. Believing the humans could not chase them across 180 kilometers of frozen wasteland riddled with thin ice plates, radiation storms, and nanite contamination, they were wrong. The humans walked the death march of Ceres as it came. To be known was a 6-day foot assault through terrain hostile to both machine and man. There were no vehicles, no food drops, no automated support. Temperatures dropped below -80 degrees Celsius. Radiation levels spiked unpredictably, and the rebels used long-range cannons to shell any moving column. Still, Terrans marched. Zalari long-range scans picked up stunning data. Soldiers using scavenged power cells to heat ration packs. Units forming rotating formations so those in the rear could sleep while walking. Severely wounded soldiers tied to stretchers and carried by squads for days, without hesitation. One soldier was observed dragging a broken ammo crate for 3 hours with his teeth after both arms were injured. He never asked to stop. Another was recorded screaming at a teammate to stay awake, "You die if you sleep," while slapping his face in a blizzard. To the Zilari, who valued rest, recalibration, and psychological balance during warfare, this was madness. But to the humans, it was duty battle in the hollow, when the human column finally reached the rebel base deep within the planetary crust. They were half-starved, frostbitten, low on ammo, and running on sheer willpower. The rebels mocked them through open coms. They said, "You're done. Go home. No tech, no gear, no fight." The human commander replied with only 2 words, "We're here." Then the final assault began. The Terrans launched their attack without hesitation. The charge was captured by Zalari drones positioned high above the crevasse. It looked more like a stampede than a battle. Soldiers sprinted across exposed ground, wielding steel axes, reinforced crowbars, mining drills, and even sharpened alloy pipes. They had no energy shields, just courage. The rebels were equipped with energy rifles and defensive turrets. They still lost. Why? Because the humans moved too fast. They came in screaming, swinging, roaring through the dust and fire like berserkers. Their blood had frozen in their veins. Their limbs trembled. But their eyes were focused. The rebel defensive systems, calibrated for standard military patterns, couldn't keep up with their unpredictability. The humans didn't take cover. They closed the gap, weapon in hand, until the enemy line broke. 1 unit of 30 humans took down a bunker defended by 80 rebels using pickaxes and shovels. No reinforcements. No surrender. By the time the rebel leader tried to signal surrender, it was too late. The humans had already reached the command chamber, but instead of executing him, they did something else, something worse. They took him alive and made him walk. Went 80 kilometers through the snow. Carrying the wounded, the message was clear. You made us march through hell. Now, you'll feel every step of it. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. The Zalari reaction, back aboard That-9, the Zalari were silent. Not because of the violence, but because of the endurance they had witnessed. They didn't understand it. Every other species would have retreated, regrouped, or surrendered. No one fought like that without external compulsion. No AI overrides, no hive mind commands, no genetic rage programs. These humans did it by choice, out of loyalty, out of stubborn pride, and out of something the Zalari had no translation for something. In Terran tongues that hovered somewhere between grit and defiance, they reviewed the bioscans of the soldiers. Post-march, dehydrated, sleep-deprived, organ damage, radiation exposure. By all logical medical standards, half the force should have been dead. They weren't. They had walked through death and kept walking. Legacy of the march. The death march of Ceres became legend first, whispered among military analysts, then among cultural researchers, eventually among species who had never even met a human. To humans, it was another operation. One more sacrifice to the galaxy. It was the day the myth of human invincibility was born, not because of firepower, not because of numbers, but because when everything else is stripped away, when weapons fail, when tech dies, when comfort is, gone humanity still fights. They bleed, they burn, they crawl forward. Overseer. Tellin wrote only one line in his report on the series' engagement. They didn't win because they had more. They won because they refused to stop. For the first time, some auxiliary personnel requested transfer away from war observation units, not because they feared death, because they feared seeing what humans would become next. Part 4. The last broadcast, explained in 1100 words by the time Tar Cisne became the focus of the war. The galaxy was already watching with unease. Whispers had spread across species and systems, not just of humanity's strength, but of their relentless will, their horrifying endurance, and their brutal efficiency. The battles of New Sapporo, Novus Vega, and Series 7 had become case studies in military academies, though many instructors refused to show raw footage due to the psychological effects on viewers. Still, many believed those events represented the height of human warfare. They hadn't seen Tar Cisne yet, and for the Xylari Consortium, it would mark the final moment of their impartiality. Because what happened on Tar Cisne didn't just defy military doctrine. It shattered something deeper in the minds of the observers. It made them question not just human warfare, but themselves. The stakes. Tar Cisne held hostage. Tar Cisne wasn't a military colony. It was a research world, a scientific haven built in orbit around a mineral-rich planet. Its inhabitants were engineers, teachers, artists, and exobiologists, a cultural gem, which made it a prime target for the crumbling Rebel Alliance in a desperate final gambit. The last major Rebel warlord, Commander Drail Vosk, invaded Tar Cisne with a force of 18,000 troops. He took the planetary domes hostage, shut down long-range communication arrays, and activated planetary shields. Civilians were herded into containment zones. Local security forces were overwhelmed in minutes. Then came the message to Earth. Tar Cisne now belongs to us. You try to take it back, and we begin executions one every hour. The message was broadcast across human systems. Too many species. This was a solid move. Hostages, leverage, and planetary shields. It was textbook deterrence to the humans. It was a line that should never have been crossed, and so the response came. The quiet before the storm. Earth didn't send a reply. No transmission. No demand. No threat. The Xylari monitoring stations thought this was uncharacteristic of the Terrans. But aboard the Terran warfleet gathering silently in Tarsi's orbit, there was a different kind of conversation unfolding. The operation was codenamed Judgment Protocol for the first time. Humanity wasn't just deploying soldiers, it was deploying a psychological weapon designed to break the enemy before a single shot was fired. Phase 1. The shadows whisper on the third day of the siege. Tarsus. Nine's rebels began experiencing hallucinations, or so they thought. They heard voices over there comes fragmented and distorted cries that resembled the very people they had executed. Begging for mercy or whispering threats. Screens flickered to show the faces of soldiers they had killed. The Xylari observers traced the origin. Terran drones flying undetected through the cloud layers, broadcasting psychological warfare signals using reconstructed audio logs and AI-generated images. Some rebels shot at shadows. Others began to panic. Entire squads surrendered to trees or rocks. Phase 2. The light that lied at dawn on day 5. The rebels awoke to sunlight that wasn't real. The clouds parted, and for the first time since the invasion, the colony was bathed in warm golden rays. But Tar Cisne doesn't have a sun that rises like that. It orbits a gas giant. The light source was an array of Terran reflectors and luminary. Drones artificially simulating dawn in a place where it should not occur. When the rebels looked up, they saw Terran warships, completely motionless. Hanging in the sky like judgmental gods, they didn't move. They didn't fire. They just watched. That day, dozens of rebel soldiers deserted. A few collapsed from stress. The Zalari analysts recorded spikes in fear responses so high that it triggered neural synchronization across entire squads' sympathetic mass hysteria. Phase 3. The Ghosts move on day 6. Terran forces deployed on the surface. Not with tanks or bombers, but with light-bending cloaks, silent weapons, and motion-sensed boots that made zero detectable impact. One by one, rebel command posts began going dark. No gunfire was heard. No alarms sounded. Cameras simply stopped. Transmitting patrols never returned. Drones saw bodies slumped over tables, shot cleanly through the head or neck without signs of struggle. Entire rebel formations retreated into their strongholds. Some even began to seal themselves in out of paranoia. By this point, Zalari weren't observing war. They were observing surgical unraveling, a mental collapse delivered with terrifying elegance. Overseer, Stalen noted, the Terrans have bypassed conflict entirely. They are now fighting the enemy's mind. Phase 4. The broadcast in the 7th day finally sent a message. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even spoken. It was a video. It showed one of the Terran units infiltrating a rebel barracks. The soldiers didn't fire unless necessary. They disabled weapons, stunned personnel, evacuated hostages, and left quietly. No brutality, just absolute control. The message ended with a single phrase. Text on screen, "This is restraint." 3 hours later, Commander Vosk comes with Earth and said, "We surrender. Just please stop." The humans responded by sending medical ships and civilian evacuators immediately, but the Terran soldiers stayed. Not to punish, but to witness the handover of every last hostage. No joy in victory when the last of the civilians were safely out and the rebel command formally disarmed. The Terrans didn't celebrate. There was no cheering, no shouting, no anthem. They simply packed their gear, collected their fallen, and left to them. This wasn't triumph. It was justice administered not with fire, but with clarity. Not with chaos, but with calculated power. The Zalari tried to interview a Terran captain afterward. They asked him, "Why didn't you retaliate with full force? You had the power to vaporize them." The captain looked into the camera and replied, "We fight to stop wars, not to make more ghosts." That quote was later inscribed on a plaque aboard the Zilari vessel Theta-9. What the Zilari saw back aboard the observation ship. Overseer Tellen gathered his analysts. None of them spoke for a long time. Tellen finally asked, "Can we still call ourselves observers when what we're observing breaks us?" The team had watched thousands of wars. They had seen cruelty, power, even genocide. But they had never seen precision without malice. They had never seen wrath, wrapped in restraint. And more than that, they had never seen an enemy forgiven but never forgotten. They watched the rebels taken away in cuffs, not coffins, and that haunted them more than any battlefield ever could, because the humans didn't just defeat their enemies, they left them alive to remember the final report, the official consortium report on the Tarses. Operation included clinical details, battle durations, casualty numbers, technological performance, but at the very end, in a section titled Observer Emotional Notes, the following sentence was written by every Zalari team member. "I do not know if I can dream again, because now in every silence, I hear the Terrans." It was the last broadcast from Theta-9. Afterward, the Zalari shut down further observation of human conflicts, not by order, but by choice. Part 5. No More Dreams. Explained in 1100 words, the war had ended. Tar-Sisnan had surrendered. The last rebel strongholds fell without further resistance. Earth issued no punishment decrees, no executions, and no occupation mandates. Instead, the Terran forces quietly dismantled what was left of their own war machine and began rebuilding the systems they'd broken. The galaxy To centuries of post-war vengeance and scorched earth policies, didn't understand, and for the Xylari Consortium, who had observed this war from start to finish, understanding wasn't the problem anymore. Coping was. Because even though the war was over, the memories of what they had seen, the raw, unfiltered human way of fighting, refused to leave them. It haunted them in ways they couldn't explain. And worst of all, they could no longer dream. Back aboard That-9, the Silence of Victory, the observation vessel. That-9 had returned from the Tarsi system weeks earlier. It floated in a neutral orbit near Xylari space, its databanks overflowing with terabytes of recordings, combat logs, emotional resonance charts, and unfiltered neural feedback loops from the entire war. But while the ship's systems functioned perfectly, its crew did not. At first, Overseer Talen and his analysts assumed the stress would fade with time. After all, they had observed wars before, many of them brutal. The Consortium had documented conflicts that wiped out entire planets, genocides, carried out by mind parasites, star-burning weapons of mass extinction, and yet they had always processed and recovered. But this time was different. Days passed, and weeks. No one slept. Not truly. What is sleep without safety? The Xylari species didn't sleep in the human sense. Their brains entered meditative. Dream constructs cycles a deep, lucid state of neural reorganization that allowed their minds to decompress and recalibrate. It was essential for sanity, emotional regulation, and long-term cognition. But now, every time they entered dream space, they were dragged out, sweating, shaking, convulsing. Their systems registered no physical danger, no foreign pathogens, no cybernetic contamination. The medical teams were baffled. It wasn't a disease, it was a memory. They weren't experiencing dreams, they were reliving battles. The ghosts of humanity's war in the minds of the Xylari images had taken root, burned so deep into their subconscious that no medtech could extract them. They saw Terran soldiers dragging bleeding comrades through a firestorm, his faces locked in stoic defiance. They heard the shriek of makeshift weapons tearing through reinforced steel in the Ceres caverns. They felt the silence of Tarsesni, when Terran operatives moved like shadows through the fog, killing only when necessary and never more than that. They remembered the words spoken by a human commander on a captured rebel broadcast. "We will break your weapons. We will break your walls, but we will not break your soul." Right. You'll do that yourselves by living through this. The phrase echoed in their minds like a curse, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Analyzing the trauma of the consortiums, top xenopsychologists reviewed the data. They tried to rationalize the reaction. They broke the experience into categories. Tactical overwhelm, human strategies defied pattern recognition, emotional saturation, constant exposure to raw, unfiltered, empathy and pain, cognitive dissonance, seeing a species capable of immense brutality, but driven by loyalty and restraint. But none of those categories accounted for the depth of emotional damage suffered by the Xylari. Crew.1, analyst Droz Drenzumed it. Up best in his private log, "We were prepared to witness power. We were not prepared to witness humanity." The realization, it wasn't about. Death was common in war. The Xylari had cataloged trillions of battlefield fatalities across species and centuries. They had seen slow deaths, fast deaths, ritual deaths, even meaningless ones. But the trauma from this war came not from watching humans kill. It came from watching how far they would go not to die, how they clawed forward. Wounded and burning, refusing to surrender, how they carried their injured, even if it meant slower movement and higher casualties. How they risked everything to save hostages instead of bombarding from orbit. This wasn't just strategy, it was a philosophy. Humans didn't see war as destruction. They saw it as a test, a measure of who you were when everything else was taken away. And they passed every single time. The decision. No more observation. 3 weeks after returning home, Overseer Talen sent a private transmission to Consortium Command. I formally request the decommissioning of all Terran War monitoring missions. Not out of fear, but out of mercy for ourselves. The message was signed by every single crew member of Theta-9. Soon after, other observation crews across the galaxy submitted similar reports. Those who had witnessed Terran combativants secondhand suffered from insomnia, stream fractures, and neural instability. The effect was uniquely human. No other species' wars had produced such psychological backlash. The conclusion was clear. Humanity's war wasn't just something you watched. It was something you carried forever. A new reputation is bornward. Of the Zillari's withdrawals spread quietly across the galactic community. At first, it was dismissed as weakness. Then came the leaked footage of Terrans walking half-naked through the nanoplague of Ceres. Of them holding children with bloody hands on tarsi, of a dying Marine grinning as he shouted, "We'll finish the job. Just get home." And suddenly, everyone understood. Empires began issuing new doctrines. Avoid direct confrontation with human forces. Do not provoke Earth. If hostilities are unavoidable, surrender immediately. A new term entered the lexicon of galactic military academies: Terran burn. A psychological condition triggered by witnessing the full moral and physical endurance of a human combat unit. And it wasn't just soldiers, even diplomats. Merchants and researchers began to show symptoms after watching war logs. One Zillari scholar proposed a law to ban the public distribution of any Terran combat footage. It passed unanimously. The final words of Overseer Tilen Aversier, Tilen retired from service shortly after. In his final address to the consortium, he said, "We thought we were watching a primitive species. We thought war was something. We understood, but now, when we close our eyes, we don't see tactics. We see a man crawling through fire to save a friend. We see soldiers laughing with bleeding mouths. We see restraint used with more precision than any weapon ever made. We see ... humanity. And that's what keeps us awake." His speech was broadcast only once before it was archived. Many who listened reported weeks of disrupted sleep afterward. The archive was sealed. No more dreams, though. Title of this final chapter speaks both literally and symbolically. The Zillari lost their ability to dream not just in their minds, but in their hearts. They could no longer see war as something clean or academic. They could no longer view death as numbers. They could no longer watch a battle and believe they were separate from it, because once you've seen what humans are willing to endure, you know the truth. You will never fight like them. You will never survive what they survive. And if they come for you not in rage but with calm determination, there is nothing you can do to stop them.